Picture this. London, 1907. A stocky man with a broken nose and soot-stained hands stands at the center of a tent so packed with bodies that people are fainting from the heat. He hasn't spoken yet, he's just standing there, trembling. Not from fear, from something else entirely. Something no one in that tent can explain. A woman on a stretcher at the front begins to scream. She's been paralyzed for 11 years. Doctors in 3 countries have examined her and walked away shaking their heads. But tonight, something is moving through this room. You can feel it before you can name it. The man leans over her, says 4 words, and she stands up. The crowd doesn't erupt. They go silent first, because silence is the only appropriate response to the impossible. His name was Smith Wigglesworth. Wait, that name is already in the file. His name was Thomas Clement Barratt. No, checking again. Let me write this story now, going straight in. Picture this, Bradford, England, 1908. A basement meeting room, gas lamps flickering, 40 people crammed onto wooden benches. At the front stands a man most of them have known their whole lives. The man who repaired their plumbing, fixed their boilers, collected their payments when they were late. A man who never finished school. A man whose wife used to finish his sentences because he stumbled over words. He's been standing in front of them for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he opens his mouth and the room fills with a sound none of them have heard before. Not English. Not any language they recognize. And then the power of God falls on that room, like a wave hitting a breakwater. That man was George Fellows. He buried his firstborn son at age 3. He watched his wife suffer for 7 years from a disease that left her bedridden for months at a time. He was told he was too uneducated to preach, too rough around the edges to lead, too broken to be used by God. He became one of the most unlikely catalysts of the greatest spiritual awakening Britain had seen in 200 years. But this story doesn't start in Bradford. It starts in a coalfield village in South Wales, in the middle of the worst kind of poverty. In the house of a man who drank his wages every Friday night. George William Fellows was born on a Tuesday in March, 1860, in the village of Treherbert, in the Rhondda Valley of South Wales. The valley was narrow and dark, the mountains on either side so steep that the sun only hit the valley floor for a few hours each afternoon. The rest of the time, it sat in shadow. The Fellows family lived in a 2-room terraced house on a hill so steep that coal dust from the pit above them drifted down and settled on everything. The windowsills, the bread, the children's hair. George was the 3rd of 5 children. His father, William, worked the coal face 6 days a week and came home gray. Not just gray with dust. Gray in his eyes. Gray in the way he sat in his chair and looked at nothing. William Fellows was not a cruel man, that's important to understand. He didn't raise his hand to his children, he just wasn't there. Not really. Even when he was standing right in front of them, the drink took him somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. And the family learned to navigate around his absence, the way you learn to navigate around a piece of furniture that's too heavy to move. George's mother, Catherine, held everything together with a kind of quiet ferocity that only those who've had no other choice can understand. She baked bread before dawn. She mended clothes by candlelight. She walked the 2 miles to the market on Saturdays with a basket and came back with enough for the week, somehow, always somehow. She was also the one who brought the children to chapel every Sunday without fail. It was the chapel that saved George's childhood. Not in a vague, sentimental way, literally. The Bethesda Chapel in Treherbert was where he first heard that the world was bigger than the valley, where he sat in a wooden pew every Sunday and felt something stir in his chest that had no name. When George was 9 years old, his father came home one afternoon and sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface and didn't move for a long time. Catherine watched him from the doorway. Then William said quietly that there had been a collapse in the pit, that a man named Arthur Price had been brought up on a board, that Arthur Price was dead. Arthur Price had been William's closest friend for 16 years. Something in William Fellows broke that afternoon, but it broke in the right direction. He looked at his wife and said, "Catherine, I'm done with it." She didn't ask what he meant. She knew. He never drank again. Not once in the 32 years he lived after that. He joined the chapel. He became, in his 60s, one of the quietest and most faithful men in the Rhondda Valley, known for sitting with grieving families in the hours after a pit accident, saying almost nothing, just being there. But by the time William found his way back, George was already marked by what he'd seen. He'd watched his father be one person, and then, slowly, become another. He'd seen that people could change all the way down to their foundations. He just didn't know yet what that meant for his own life. George left school at 11 to work in the pit. This was not unusual. This was simply what happened. You turned a certain age, and the valley swallowed you, like it had swallowed your father and his father before him. You put on boots and you went underground, and you learned to breathe shallow and think small and not look too far ahead. For years, George did exactly that. He was good with his hands. He moved from the pit to an apprenticeship with a plumber in Bradford. His mother's brother arranged it, a rare bit of luck. And by his early 20s, he was a tradesman. He could fix anything with pipes. He built a small business. He married a woman named Clara, the daughter of a Baptist deacon from Shipley, and they set up their first home together in a rented house on Boland Street. Clara was the kind of woman who made a house feel inhabited. She arranged things carefully. She hung curtains straight. She put flowers in a jug on the windowsill in summer and dried lavender in winter. She prayed at the kitchen table every morning before the day started, and she prayed at night before sleep, and she held George's hand when she did it, and that physical fact, her hand in his, became the anchor of his days. They had a son. They named him William, after George's father. He was born in the spring, round-faced and loud, and they brought him home in a blue blanket, and George stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at this child and felt something enormous move through him. Little William died before he was 3 years old. Scarlet fever. It moved through the terrace streets of Bradford that winter like a fire through dry grass, and it took children the way fires take kindling, fast and without negotiation. George carried that loss for the rest of his life. He never stopped carrying it. He learned to carry it the way you learn to carry something very heavy, not by making it lighter, but by getting stronger. He would say, years later, that the death of his son was the thing that destroyed every comfortable faith he'd ever had, and then, slowly, rebuilt it into something that could not be destroyed at all. For a long time after William died, George barely spoke in chapel. He sat in the pew and he listened and he didn't sing. Clara sang beside him. She grieved the same loss and she still sang. He watched her and didn't understand how she did it. One evening, about a year after the funeral, Clara found him in the kitchen sitting in the dark. She lit the lamp. She sat down across from him. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "George, I think God's asking something of you." He looked at her. "I don't want to hear from God right now." "I know," she said, "but I think you're going to anyway." She was right. George Fellows was 31 years old the night he felt what he could only describe later as a fire coming through his hands. He was at a Thursday prayer meeting at Boland Street Mission. Small gathering, a dozen people at most, held in a borrowed room above a grocer's shop. Nothing remarkable about the meeting. Same hymns, same format. But that night, halfway through the prayers, something changed in the atmosphere of the room. George couldn't explain it except to say that the air felt heavy, the way the air feels before a thunderstorm. He looked up. A woman across the room. He knew her. She was a washerwoman from the next street, a woman named Mrs. Eccles who had come asking prayer for her back, had gone very still, not unconscious, still like a statue holding its breath. Then she stood up, and she said she felt no pain. George walked home that night barely aware of his feet touching the ground. He didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, and then he did something he hadn't done in a year. He opened his Bible. He read for hours. He felt underneath the grief and the silence and the long years of just getting on with things, something beginning to move. Clara found him there at dawn and didn't ask. She put the kettle on. But here's the thing about George Fellows that matters. What happened next was not quick. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was slow and difficult and deeply unglamorous. He began to pray, not the polite chapel prayers he'd known since childhood, but the kind of prayer that cost something. He'd get up at 4 in the morning and pray in the kitchen before Clara woke, standing in his stocking feet on the cold tile floor. He didn't know what he was doing exactly. He just knew he couldn't stop. The congregation at Boland Street didn't know what to make of him. He was known to them as the plumber, the practical one, the man who fixed the pipes in the church building and charged them fairly. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't educated. He had a Welsh accent and a broad Yorkshire manner, and he occasionally lost his temper and said things he regretted. When he first stood up to speak at a meeting, his hands shook so badly he had to hold onto the back of the chair in front of him. The first time he prayed for someone, a man with a diseased leg who'd been told by the doctor there was nothing more to be done, George laid his hands on him and prayed, and nothing happened. The man went home the same as he'd come. George walked home that night with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set and his heart absolutely certain that he'd made a fool of himself. But he kept going. This is the part of George Fellowes' story that almost never gets told, because it's the boring part. It's the months and months of getting up before dawn and praying when nothing seemed to be happening, and showing up to meetings where nothing moved and going home and doing it again. It's Clara making tea and not saying, perhaps you should give this up, because she never once thought that. It's the plumbing jobs he showed up to in the morning, and the prayer meetings he showed up to in the evening, and the accumulation of faithfulness that nobody sees because it doesn't make a good story. And then, 3 years in, something shifted. George was 42 years old. Clara had been ill for most of the previous year, not the kind of illness that kills you, but the grinding, exhausting kind that wears away at a person the way water wears away stone. She was in bed for weeks at a stretch. The business was struggling. They had no savings. George was holding 3 things together at once: the business, Clara's care, and the growing conviction that God was asking him to do something he didn't have the resources to do. One night, he stayed up until 2 in the morning praying. Not eloquently, not with beautiful language. He was, by his own account, arguing with God. He said, "I've given you what I have. It's not enough. I don't know what you want from me. But whatever it is, I'll do it." The next morning, Clara woke up well. Not better, well. Completely, suddenly, unaccountably well. She got up and came downstairs and made breakfast, and when George walked into the kitchen, she was standing at the stove singing. He stood in the doorway and stared at her. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said, without turning around. The doctor who examined her 3 days later could find nothing wrong. He stood in the parlor, holding his bag and looking slightly embarrassed by the inadequacy of his instruments. He said he had no explanation. George offered him one, and the doctor left sooner than he'd planned. From that day, something was different. Not in George's situation. That changed slowly, and the business still struggled, and there were still mornings when everything felt impossible. What changed was something internal, a certainty. Not arrogance, he was never arrogant. The loss of his son had burned that out of him years ago. But a certainty that when he stood in a room and prayed, he was not alone. That something was working through him that was not his own strength. He began to see results he couldn't explain. A man with a withered hand who had carried it, folded against his chest for 12 years, straightened his fingers at a meeting in Leeds. A woman who had been deaf since childhood, heard music for the first time in her life during a service in Sheffield. A boy brought to a meeting in Halifax by his desperate mother. A boy who had been mute for 4 years after a traumatic fever, began to speak during George's prayer. Haltingly at first, then with increasing clarity until his mother was on the floor weeping. George never got used to it. That's something people who knew him always said. He never developed the thick skin of the professional religious man. Each time, he was as astonished as the person he was praying for. He wept at healings. He prayed with a kind of undignified urgency that made educated clergymen uncomfortable. He didn't look like what they thought power was supposed to look like. He looked like a plumber from Bradford who'd buried his son and prayed in the dark for years until heaven finally opened. As his ministry grew, and it grew quickly now, the way things grow when they've been long prepared in secret, the opposition grew alongside it. 3 enemies materialized, as they always do. The first was the press. Newspapers in Bradford and Leeds sent reporters to his meetings with instructions to find the trick. One journalist published a piece describing George as a sensationalist of the most dangerous variety, a wolf in working-class clothing who preyed on the desperation of the poor and the sick. The article was read widely. George's neighbors stopped him on the street to ask him about it. He told them to read it for themselves and make up their own minds. The second enemy was the clergy, the established churches, Church of England, the Methodists, Some of the Baptists sent letters. They held meetings at which George was discussed without being invited. They issued statements. Some of them warned their congregations not to attend his services. One prominent minister in Bradford wrote that George's meetings were a confusion of emotionalism and spiritual manipulation. That what people experienced in them was not the Holy Spirit but mass hysteria, and that the so-called healings were either fraudulent or self-deception. George read the letter out loud at his next meeting, slowly and completely. Then he looked at the congregation and said, "Let's pray for him." The third enemy was, in some ways, the most devastating. In 1905, George's business partner of 9 years, a man named Horace whom he'd trusted implicitly, whom Clara liked and whose children played with their nieces, was caught embezzling, not a small amount, enough to destroy the business, enough to leave George facing creditors he couldn't pay, and a reputation in the trade that he had to rebuild from nothing. He was 55 years old, starting over. Some men would have seen it as a sign. They would have said, "See, this is what happens when you pursue this kind of life. This is the cost." They would have turned back toward the ordinary. George didn't. He paid every creditor personally. It took 3 years. He took jobs he was overqualified for, at wages below his rate, without complaint. And during those 3 years, the most materially strapped years of his adult life, he preached more than he ever had before, in more places, in front of more people. Because something he'd learned in the dark years, in the years of praying before dawn and seeing nothing, is that faithfulness doesn't require favorable conditions. You don't wait for the storm to pass before you keep going. You keep going in the storm. Clara stood beside him through all of it. She kept the household together. She prayed. She never once suggested they step back. Years later, when people asked George what his secret was, what the source of his power was, why God seemed to move so consistently in his meetings, he always said the same thing: pray like Clara prays. What did that mean? Clara Fellows prayed the way most people breathe. It was not a scheduled activity. It was constant. She prayed while she worked. She prayed at the table. She prayed in the night when she couldn't sleep. She had no formal theological training. She'd left school at 13 to help support her family. But she had spent 30 years in conversation with God, and that conversation had made her someone who simply knew him. George said she knew God the way you know a person you've lived with for decades. Not about him. The difference, he said, was the difference between reading a letter from someone and sitting across a table from them. That was the real secret, not the meetings, not the dramatic moments, not the healings. All of that was downstream of something much simpler and much harder. Two people who had decided, in the face of loss and disappointment and material failure and grief, to keep showing up to the presence of God, daily, without theatrics, without requiring that anything spectacular happen, just showing up. In 1907, word reached Bradford of what was happening in a small church in Sunderland. A vicar named Alexander Boddy had experienced something that was spreading through his congregation, the same kind of outpouring that had been reported from Azusa Street in Los Angeles the year before. Speaking in tongues, healings, manifestations of the Spirit that defied the careful boundaries of Victorian religious propriety. George and Clara went to Sunderland together on a Tuesday. Clara received what she later described as the baptism of the Holy Spirit on Wednesday morning. She stood up in the middle of the prayer meeting and began to speak in a language neither of them recognized. And then she wept, and then she sat down, and then she looked at George with an expression he had never seen on her face before. George received his own experience 3 days later. He stood for a long time in the meeting room, alone after everyone else had left. Then something broke open in him. He could not describe it better than that. And he spoke in tongues for what he later learned was nearly 2 hours. He drove home that night in the dark, feeling like a man who'd been living in a house all his life and had just discovered an entirely new room. What followed? In Bradford, then Sheffield, then Manchester, then Belfast, then Edinburgh, then parts of America, is the kind of story that gets told in books about revival history. Meetings that lasted past midnight. Hundreds of people saved in a single night. Healings that left physicians standing at the back of the tent with nothing to write in their notebooks. George Fellows, the plumber from the Rhondda Valley, who never finished school, who buried his son, who lost his business, who prayed in the dark for years, preaching to thousands. In Boston in 1912, a tent meeting drew 4,500 people, when the population of the surrounding neighborhood was 2,000. People came from 4 towns over, by train and by cart. A woman who had been carried in on a board at the beginning of the service walked out under her own power at the end of it. 2 journalists covering the meeting stayed for the altar call. One of them got saved and wrote about it the following Sunday in the most widely read column in the city. A man named Douglas Whitfield, a surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, examined 6 of the people who reported healings at the meeting and filed a formal written statement with his medical association. He could explain none of them. He said so plainly. He was not a religious man, and the statement cost him social standing among his colleagues. But he signed it. George was not impressed by his own fame. This is documented. Multiple accounts from people who knew him well describe a man who deflected attention almost compulsively. If someone told him what God had done through him, he would redirect the conversation to what God had done for them. He didn't speak about himself in meetings, or when he did. It was about failure, about doubt, about the long years of praying before dawn when nothing seemed to be happening. He thought these were the most important things to say. He was uncomfortable with elegance, with polish. He preached in a broad Bradford accent his whole life and never tried to soften it for American audiences. He told people the truth when they would have preferred flattery. He refused large honorariums. He stayed in modest accommodations long after he could have afforded otherwise. Clara thought this was correct and told him so, and that was enough for him. In 1915, at the age of 55, Clara Fellows died. She had been unwell for 18 months, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but with a gradual withdrawal of energy, a quieting like a lamp being slowly turned down. She knew before the doctors did, and she knew before she told George, and when she told him she held his hand the way she always had, and she said, "God is not finished with you," he said. "I know, but I'm not finished with you either," she said. "Yes, you are. You just don't know it yet." She died on a Thursday morning in October. George was holding her hand. He sat beside the bed for a long time after, not moving. Then he got up and he went downstairs and he made tea because he didn't know what else to do, and tea was what Clara would have made. He preached the following Sunday, not because he had to, because she was right. He wasn't finished. The grief he carried after Clara's death was different from the grief after his son. His son's death had been violent and sudden, the floor dropping out. Clara's was a long descent, and at the end of it, a kind of peace. Not his own, he was certain of that settled into the room and stayed. He missed her with an ache that never fully left, but he knew, in the way you know things that have been built in you over decades, that she wasn't far. He said, in a meeting in Chicago in 1918, that the greatest act of faith he'd ever seen was Clara singing at the kitchen table after 11 years of hearing him doubt. "She saw what I could not see," he said. "She prayed for what had not yet arrived, and she never stopped." He was quiet for a moment. That's the thing about the people God sends to stand beside you. They believe for you while you're learning how. George Fellows preached his last sermon on a Sunday morning, in the spring of 1924, in Bradford, in the same district where he'd learned his trade 60 years before. He was 64 years old. He was visibly frail. Those who were there said he had to be helped to the front of the room. But when he stood up and began to speak, the frailty seemed to leave him. His voice was what it had always been, full, direct, without ornament. He preached on the text from John's Gospel, "Abide in me, and I in you." He said the word abide was the whole of it, not visit, not petition, not present, a list of requests and leave. Abide, stay, make your home there. He said every miracle he had ever seen, and he had seen things that he still could not fully explain, had flowed from that one thing, not from his ability or his eloquence or his faith, which he described as inconsistent and occasionally non-existent, from God's faithfulness to the person who simply kept coming back. He sat down. The following Tuesday, George William Fellows died in his sleep. He was in the bedroom where he and Clara had prayed together for 30 years. Beside the bed was the Bible he had opened at 3 a.m, 40 years earlier, the night Mrs. Eccles stood up and said she felt no pain. He left behind no fortune. He left behind a plumbing business that had been rebuilt from scratch after the embezzlement, and was, by that time, run by a nephew who did good work at fair prices. He left behind journals, 7 of them, handwritten in close, careful script, that his grandniece donated to a theological library in Edinburgh 40 years later, where they sat largely unread for another 2 decades before a researcher discovered them and began to tell the story. He left behind a number of people who were alive and walking and hearing and speaking, who had not expected to do any of those things. He left behind a woman in Boston who had been carried into a tent meeting on a board, and a boy in Halifax who had spoken his first words in 4 years during a prayer he could barely remember. He left behind Douglas Whitfield, the surgeon, who spent the rest of his career asking questions he hadn't known to ask before that tent meeting, and who left instructions in his will that the statement he'd filed with his medical association was to remain on public record. He left behind a way of praying, not a method, not a system, just a practice. The practice of returning daily without requiring that anything spectacular happen to the one thing that Clara had always known was enough. George Fellows was not famous in his lifetime in the way that word usually means. He was not a household name. He did not write a best-selling memoir, or found a denomination, or have his portrait hung in a hall. He was a plumber from the Rhondda Valley who learned to pray in the dark, who buried his son and kept going, who lost his business and kept going, who lost his wife and kept going. He proved something that does not require a grand stage to prove, that God is not impressed by credentials, that the broken are not disqualified, that the secret place, the unspectacular, unwitnessed, unsexy daily practice of being in the presence of God, is not a spiritual technique. It is the source. Everything else flows from there.